Inside this trailer, a man slowly starved to death over the course of 90 days, all while surrounded by enough food to feed him for a year. His shoes were missing from his feet, but sitting next to him was a pair of shoes that didn't belong to him. Outside the trailer, in the surrounding forest, the remains of 3 other men were found scattered throughout the brush. The 5th man was never found. This is the chilling mystery of the Yuba County 5. On the night of February 24th, 1978, 5 men went missing in the Sierra Nevada mountains. There was no crime scene, there were no signs of struggle, and there was no reason for them to even be there. Days later, their car was found perfectly functional. It was 70 miles in the opposite direction of their destination, abandoned in the snow in the middle of nowhere. And over the next few months, investigators would uncover a trail of clues so strange that this case instantly became one of the most bizarre mysteries in American history. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. That night, 5 men piled into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego and drove to Chico to watch the UC Davis Aggies play, their favorite basketball team. The group was made up of 5 friends from Yuba City, California. Jack Madruga was the driver. He owned the car. It was his absolute prized possession. Also in the car was Bill Sterling, who was known as friendly and dependable. Then there was Jack Hewitt, who loved sports and rarely missed planned events. And Ted Weiher, who was quiet and routine focused. And then you had Gary Mathias, who was former military. He lived with schizophrenia, but he was stable and independent when medicated. They were known around town as the Boys. Most of them had mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions, but they were very high functioning. They held jobs, they managed their own lives, and they were respected around their community. Above all, they were obsessed with basketball. They reportedly made this trip many times before. They had their own big tournament scheduled for the very next morning. It was a Special Olympics game with a week-long trip to Los Angeles as the grand prize, something they never would have missed. Their families later reported that they were so excited about their tournament that they laid out their uniforms on their beds and asked their families to make sure they didn't oversleep. Their bags were packed and they were ready for the biggest day of their lives. But the next morning, when the sun rose over Yuba City, 5 bedrooms were still empty. The families knew something was wrong immediately. There was no way they'd miss their basketball tournament. And these weren't men who just wandered off. They thrived on routine. So the families contacted authorities immediately. The police started a massive search, tracing the route from Chico to Yuba City. It should have been a simple 1-hour drive down a flat, well-lit highway. The search went on, and 3 days later, a forest ranger found something that made the investigators' blood curdle. High in the Plumas National Forest, a remote, snow-covered area that none of the men had any reason to be in, sat the Mercury Montego. It was parked on a remote mountain ridge, on a rough, unpaved logging trail. When the police reached the car, they expected to find it crashed or stuck in a ditch, but the car was fine. It had plenty of gas. The keys were gone, but the engine started right up when authorities hotwired it. It was in the perfect working order, and it would have been easy for the men to just push it out of the snow and drive it down to safety. Yet, for some reason, they didn't. There was no sign of the men, no blood, no struggle, just an abandoned car sitting less than a foot of snow. Investigators were baffled. None of the men had any reason to be there. It wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't an area they were familiar with. It added miles. It added elevation. It added danger from the winter elements that none of the men were prepared for. It was the dead of winter. Snowbanks lined the road. Temperatures were consistently below freezing, and cell phones didn't even exist yet. The search teams headed out, but heavy snow moved in, and the winter conditions limited access. Search teams were forced to scale back, and eventually the search was called off. The families were left to wonder, why would 5 men, one of whom was terrified of the dark and another who guarded his car like a prized jewel, drive up a rough mountain road and simply walk away? Months passed, and the families still didn't have any answers. But when the snow finally melted, it revealed a scene that was far more terrifying than a simple disappearance. Fast forward to June. A group of motorcyclists on a road trip came across a Forest Service trailer about 19 miles away from where the car had been abandoned. To reach the trailer, the men would have had to hike for miles through deep mountain snow, sometimes rising to waist height in total darkness, wearing only light windbreakers. A journey that should have stopped them long before they got there. The motorcyclists noticed that the front window of the trailer had been broken out, so they peeked their heads in to see what was inside. When they opened the door to the trailer, the smell hit them. Inside, laying in a bunk with 8 sheets wrapped around him, was the body of Ted Weiher. He was covered as if someone had tried to keep him warm. He was unrecognizable. Ted was a big man, usually weighing over 200 pounds, but when they found him, he barely weighed 100. The growth of his beard and the weight loss suggest he'd survived in that trailer from anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks, slowly starving to death. And this is where the case becomes absolutely baffling. The trailer was a goldmine of survival gear. If you were trying to stay alive out there, this is exactly the place you'd want to find. There was a locker full of freeze-dried meals, enough to feed all 5 men for months, but only a few had been opened. There was a propane tank outside that could have provided heat and light with the flip of a switch. It was never touched. There were heavy blankets, matches, wood, all untouched. Ted Weiher sat in the dark, freezing and starving for months. But as the investigators looked closer, they found something that shook them to their core. Someone else had been there, because beside the bed sat a pair of shoes that didn't belong to him. They belonged to Gary Mathias. The discovery of the trailer triggered a massive sweep of the surrounding woods, and the bodies began to appear. One by one, the boys were found. The remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found on opposite sides of the road, about 11 miles from the car. They likely didn't make it through the first night. Much later, the bones of Jack Hewitt were found by his own father, who joined the search party. But as they gathered the bodies, the math stopped working. Ted Weiher lived for months in that trailer. Someone was in there with him at some point. Someone had to have wrapped him in those 8 sheets, because Ted likely wouldn't have had the strength to do it himself. And someone opened those cans of food. Authorities assumed it was Gary Mathias. He was the most athletic, the one with army training. But Gary was nowhere to be found. His shoes were in that trailer, but his body was gone. Investigators were left with nothing but a confusing timeline. A group of grown men driving in the wrong direction, ending up on a logging road, abandoning their car for no reason, hiking 20 miles in waist-deep snow, and then, for reasons no one can explain, refusing to use the very supplies that would have saved their lives. But there was one more person on the mountain that night, a witness, and his story changes everything. His name was Joseph Shones. On the night the men disappeared, Shones was up on that same mountain. His car had gotten stuck in the snow, and when he was trying to push it out, he suffered a mild heart attack, so he crawled back into his car holding his chest. He cranked up his heater, and he waited for help. He claimed that at some point in the night, he saw headlights behind him. He looked out and he saw a group of men walking in the light of another vehicle. He also said he saw a woman holding a baby. Shones shouted at them for help, but he said as soon as he called out, the lights went off and the people disappeared into the darkness. Later in the night, he saw flashlights moving around in the woods. Again, he called out, but again, the lights went dark and the voices went quiet. He sat in his car for hours until he ran out of gas and hiked down the mountain the next day. Shones' testimony led to a cascade of theories, but none of them could explain the physical evidence. It's like 2 different stories were happening on that mountain at the same time. What could have caused 5 grown men to leave a perfectly working, warm vehicle to hike almost 20 miles into the wilderness? Was it a tragic accident? A coordinated attack? Were they tricked or lured? Or something worse? This is where the theories start to get dark. One theory suggests that the boys weren't lost. They were being coerced. Many people believe that a third party manipulated or forced them up that mountain. Something happened that night. They bypassed their turn home. They navigated a low-riding car, bogged down even further by 5 fully grown men inside. They drove up the mountain and then stepped out into the cold as if they were following an order. The driver's side window was rolled down, as if speaking to someone that approached the vehicle. This theory starts sounding less like an accident and more like a kidnapping. And the most chilling piece of evidence, in 2019, law enforcement stopped looking for Gary Mathias as a missing person, and they started looking for him as a homicide victim. So this theory argues that the men were intercepted. It explains the irrational decision to flee into the snow, like it was a panicked escape or some kind of threat. We have Joseph Shones' statement. the man who heard the voices and saw the flashlights go dark the second he called out. When you're facing a threat, a dark frozen mountain looks more like a hiding place. Many people believe that the boys didn't just get lost, they ran for their lives into dangerous conditions, because whatever behind them was worse. And this next theory is the official version, the one that sits in the police reports, but it's also the one that makes the least sense when you really go down the rabbit hole. They call this the fatal misadventure theory, and it's the story of a wrong turn that turned into a tragedy. On paper, this theory is the simplest explanation. One wrong turn, a stalled car, and a battle with the winter elements. Official rulings point to hypothermia and lack of confirmed trauma to the bones. It says that the boys simply got lost. They saw tracks of a snowcat that had recently groomed the trail toward the trailer, and they just followed them. But while this theory makes sense on paper, it fails the common sense test. It asks us to believe that Ted Weiher laid in bed and starved to death for 8 weeks, while cans of food sat just feet away. If this theory is true, it means that something convinced these men that night that the very things meant to save their lives shouldn't be used. It asks you to believe that nothing happened to the Yuba County Five. They simply happened to themselves. The Yuba County Five mystery remains a puzzle of clues and unanswered questions. What began as 5 friends enjoying a basketball game turned into a night of tragedy on a cold mountain. But as the files gather dust in a sheriff's office in California, the most haunting detail isn't how far they traveled or the food they didn't eat. It's the silence. It's the image of a turquoise Mercury Montego sitting in the snow. Its keys gone, gas in the tank, and a warm heater, while 5 men walked away from it and into the darkness. Every theory we have eventually hits a dead end. There are too many unanswered questions. We're left with a story of 5 friends who were inseparable in life, and in February of 1978, became inseparable in death. This isn't legend. This is sick history.